Yeah, what's a strategic game? Well, it's basically games based on decision trees, right, and optimization. So I do have to make a separation though, because I do two types. There's strategic, which is more like board games digitally, right? Like you mentioned
Hmm.
Settlers of Catan. So making that digital would be the equivalent of a strategic game on a PC. But then there's also resource management games, which are like Factorio, for example, which are about how do you do supply chain, right? And how do you structure and organize complex processes? So it's really funny because it really sometimes it doesn't feel like a game, but I just like keeping my mind engaged, and big fan of games for whatever reason. And I also have a big board game collection as well. I think board games are a spectacular way to get to know people in a safe
Hmm.
environment because they get to be competitive. You get to find out who likes to lie, who likes to bluff, how do they think, and I always enjoy kind of seeing that side of people in a kind of safe competitive environment.
Well, let me see. I have Cards Against Humanity.
Well, you can learn
Um,
a lot from people with that one too. Very
yeah,
different set of things, right? But you can definitely learn a lot.
Escape Room in a Box. What else? Scramble and chess. Well, so a little bit limited there. Not too many. I wish I had more,
But you got
but
to come down to Puerto Rico, and I'll give you some
most
recommendations.
definitely. So you're based in Puerto Rico,
I am.
and you actually got into insurance through, you know, being there. Do you want to
Yeah.
start with the insurance part, or do you want to start with your personal story of how you got into insurance?
Yeah, I'll talk about. I think it's related. They're both very connected. So I'll start a little with how exactly we stumbled into this. So this is actually my second startup. My first startup was an IoT startup based out of New York. But for family reasons, I had to move back to Puerto Rico to take care of my mother, who was really delicate at the time. And in 2017, shortly, only really a couple months after I had gotten back to Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria was announced that it was coming on the way. And I remember looking at the map and saying, oh my God, what am I going to do? Not mostly because of me, but because of my mom. She's in a wheelchair, very health delicate. So it was really just concerns about what I would do post hurricane. Once the hurricane passed, it took me 3 days to get to her because she lives really deep inside of the island. And you can imagine how horrible kind of the devastation was if it took me 3 days. This is a fairly
Hmm.
small island.
Yeah, it
There are
is.
lots of trees, lots of
Been
things in your
there,
way.
did one lap. It's
Yeah.
relatively small.
So, right. So it took me 3 days to get to her. And immediately when I got there, I was like, yeah, this is going to take a while. Like, it's going to take a long time for things to get back to normal. The ramp that she used for her wheelchair had been blown out. There was a hole in the house. It was like a whole thing. And the very first thing I did was, hey, do you have insurance? And what do I need to do to help you submit a claim with your insurance policy? Maybe we can get some FEMA help. And it was basically that process. It took us over a year to get an adjuster to show up to the house. And what's really
Wow.
wild is you can imagine what it's like to have like a ramp blown out and a hole in a house that you literally can't repair because the adjuster needs to inspect it and you just can't do anything about it. So it took us a year. And then after that, it took us 6 months of back and forth with the insurance company. And at the end of that whole process, we got zero. So the very first question that I had during that whole experience, which was obviously very horrible, was, okay, did I just have bad luck? Like, was my insurance policy just really horrible, or was this like really common in Puerto Rico? And when I started asking around to my friends, to my soon to be co-founders, I realized that this was a super common story. Like, a lot of people had very similar experiences for a lot of reasons from the event. And then the second order of question that we had was, okay, if everyone in Puerto Rico went through this, is this just a Puerto Rico problem? Like, is it just, a regulatory issue here, or is this like a universal issue? And when we started looking outwards, we found a lot of the same similar stories. Like, the media tends to focus very much on the events. So like if you have a
Hmm.
wildfire in California, they'll talk about the wildfire, but very rarely will they talk about like all the people who are still dealing with whatever was the aftermath of that wildfire. So we wanted to be part of the solution somehow. We thought the experience was so horrible that we really wanted to see if we could legitimately solve it, but we knew nothing about insurance. So we started researching, like the engineers that we were, and a concept that kept coming up was parametric insurance. And we thought parametric insurance was really interesting because to us, coming from software, it sounded like a breakdown of insurance into parameters, right? Which is exactly software. And
IFTT.
yeah,
But,
so with that logic of like, all right, this seems like something that could be sophisticated. You know, you could build like sophisticated products with this approach. Our next order of questioning was why haven't I ever seen a policy? Like, you know, why wasn't my mom offered one, for example? Why weren't any insurance companies in Puerto Rico offering parametric products at all? And we had all these layered questions, right, around that. Like, what happened then? Like, if you have a solution, it's been used for 2 decades, there's some experience with it, right? It's not a new concept. Then why isn't it mainstream? And in that process, while we were meeting with insurance companies and reinsurers and basically everyone part of that stack, what we ended up finding out was that there were these common tropes that they would keep bringing it up as reasons why they weren't doing this. Some of them were related to the risk models and detection models and the data, right? Others were related to like the infrastructure needed. So maybe a simple product doesn't need sophisticated infrastructure, but if you're like doing image recognition and all sorts of like machine learning, all of a sudden it becomes like big data, right? Big data issues. And then the last component was that even if they had a good risk model detection and everything else, many of them had legacy policy management systems that just weren't really built to be automated, right? So this idea, this vision of, hey, wouldn't have been awesome if my mother would have just gotten a text message within a couple of days of the hurricane saying, hey, you're going to receive, I don't know, $10,000 and let's deposit it directly to your bank account. That was something that they just couldn't really operate. Or if they did, there were all these manual processes that had to happen for that to get done. So that's when we said we can deliver this. Like we can solve this. What if we solve this? Like we package these products, provide the infrastructure that powers them, and then essentially deliver them to the channel or the insurance company or the reinsurer and see if they're willing to essentially distribute, right? So in a way, it's actually similar a little bit to the prior podcast that I saw with Affinity, where he was saying that they're not trying to do the distribution side of it, but rather enable that distribution. Very similar, right? In our case, where, you know, our mission is protect every single person on the planet from climate disruption, and to do that, you have to work with every single channel, which means you have to develop kind of these products, right, that are easily embeddable and that are actually really good, and the infrastructure that powers it, and that's essentially what we focus on.
wow. Okay. So you cover the first question, the second question, the third question, the fourth question. Is there anything else that we should cover today? Because I think that people today, hopefully I will beat you in your SEO, because when we go on your website, and which is teamraincoat.com, for everyone to check, it doesn't say much.
Yeah.
It just say financial coverage and links to all kind of, to Forbes, to Inc, to I think TechCrunch. I hope that I remember it correctly.
Yeah, it wasn't by design, funnily enough. Like, it's not like we were trying to be in stealth mode. I think this was organic, right? We didn't start this
Mm-hmm.
thinking we were going to make a startup by any means. We kind of started this very organically because we felt the problem and wanted to solve the problem. And then in that process, we started to formalize a startup concept around it.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of our movement has been word of mouth, right? So we do one deployment in one region, everyone's really happy with what we do, so they introduce us to another region, and that other region introduces us to another, right? So we've never actually had the need to kind of like have that in place because we've had a good reputation with everyone we've worked with,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, we have a great team that can solve a lot of these tricky challenges. That is shifting now, right? So with the announcement of the fundraise that we did recently, that has been shifting, and now we need to like get an updated website and communicate these things better. But we're at the beginning of that inflection point. So in a way, this is probably the first podcast that I do right after when we've made that decision, right, that we're going to roll that out. So maybe by the time people see this, we do have the website up, and it'll make a lot more sense, right?
First of all, I'm
But
honored.
ultimately, yeah,
Sorry. So first of all,
go
I'm
ahead.
honored that this is the first podcast, and hopefully it will be. We are recording this pre-ITC. Hopefully it will be somewhere 2 or 3 weeks after ITC. I'm sorry, guys. With ITC and DIA, there will be a little bit of delay here because besides a lot of content that we're going to generate, Yeah, we're going to be a little bit busy in those conferences. But sorry, Jonathan, for cutting you
No,
there.
no, no worries. But I guess the fundamental answer is we are doers rather than talkers, right? So we focus much more on solving these issues legitimately and driving that
Hmm.
solution and making sure that the people that matter are happy with what we've delivered, both the end consumers but also the partners that we work with. And now is the point where we're like, yeah, we should probably be a little bit louder about the work that we do and some of the great things we've worked on.
How much are you raising, or what was the announcement?
Yeah, it was our seed round. So we
Seed
raised
round.
4.5 million. There was a good group of investors, including Anthemis, which is an insuretech and fintech
Yeah.
specific investor. The SoftBank co-invested as well. We have a couple banks and insurance companies that came on board as corporate insurers, including local insurers in Puerto Rico. Sorry, local investors from Puerto Rico, like Moro Ventures and other entities like that. So it was a good group, and ultimately there's an alignment, right, in the sense that everyone agrees that this problem is super serious, like it's a very serious issue that has to be resolved, and everyone agrees that the way right to resolve this is through strategic partnerships and really developing good technology. I think one aspect that is missed a lot, I think, in the insurance industry, and it varies quite a bit. I know there's lots of really great people working on this, so I don't want to make a blanket statement, is that products matter. You know, good products actually matter. Like you can focus on sales, you can focus on distribution, but at the end of the day, there's a real human being on the other side that's purchasing a risk transfer of some kind, and that human
Hmm.
being has expectations, and those expectations have to be met. And I think oftentimes we focus a lot on the chrome, right, on the flashy outside of insurance, without forgetting, right, the fundamental aspect of insurance, which is something bad happens and a person needs to be made whole and as quickly
So I
as
wasn't.
possible.
So I wasn't sure at the beginning when you talk about a product. Did you at the beginning? I thought, okay, is he going to talk about the insurance product or the technology product? Because one of the things that, and I assume that you're referring to the insurance product, right?
It's both,
Am I
actually. It's
great?
Yeah,
Great, because that's basically where I was going with. Because, and it's very interesting that we see people who been there are insurance professionals that only think in that dimension. What is the risk? How do I move the risk between, up the supply chain, up the vertical? What do we do there? And they are more focusing about underwriting and later claims, and to manage that, can we target the right audience? Is that the right
yeah.
risk, not the right risk? And they are completely neglecting the digital or the technology,
Well,
that product. At the same time,
yeah,
or we see the entrepreneurs, maybe it was more at the early stage of insurtech, that coming with blazing saddles and like ideal in their eyes are, it's all about the technology product that we're going to deliver. I love to see that it's already merged together.
yeah, and actually, you raise a great point. So there's a story to this. One, so when I first started looking into this, my initial, because of the negative experience, my initial reaction was, man, these people have to be evil, right? Like there's like if you look at a like if you truly looked at my mom face value and you
Hmm.
looked at the situation we were in, to say no to that, it was like, all right, seriously, what's going on here? Like that's some straight up evil stuff. So how does that happen, right? Like was my thought, like how exactly systematically do we create that? And one thing that we've realized, and that's why we focus on these end to end kind of embedded solutions, is that we very quickly realized that a good product requires like a visibility over the full stack somehow, right? Like someone has to take responsibility. And oftentimes what happens with these negative experiences isn't that someone was actively trying to do harm, but rather systematically different components came into play that ended up resulting in a really bad negative experience, right? So as you mentioned, the person who was placing the risk was thinking about certain things. The person who wrote that legal contract was thinking about other things. The guy who sold, right, or the gal who sold, focused on selling the policy. So we don't know what they said. We don't know, like all these incentives that were kind of aligned ended up in a bad experience. And I think, I'm happy to see that a lot of people in the industry are starting to take sort of personal responsibility over that and say, all right, yeah, the system needs correction somehow, right? Whether it's technology or clarity or whatever, it needs correction because it's really the system that's creating kind of these events. And to add to that, we learned a lot. So one of the people who ended up joining Raincoat in the early was Luis, our chief insurance officer, and the story of Luis is actually really interesting because he's been a like a 5 times insurance CEO basically. Like he's ran insurance companies in large regions, and he was running
Hmm.
an insurance carrier in Puerto Rico as CEO at the time. At the same time that I was having this experience,
Ah, fantastic.
and it was really fascinating to see his struggle from his perspective of dealing with the situation, right? And the real pain that he had of like, man, there were moments where I wanted to just issue a check on the spot and be like, here's the money, but regulation, requirements, and all of these things would not allow him to actually be able to do that, right? For a diverse set of reasons. And it was really eye-opening to me just to realize how some of these are unsolvable problems given the context of the situation, right? Which is why completely newly imagined products are required because let's talk about the volume issue, right? Like this insurance company with the claims adjuster,
Hmm.
maybe that insurance company had like 10 claims adjusters max before Hurricane Maria, and all of a sudden you have 100,000 claims, right? Like realistically, what are they supposed to do, right? Yeah, they can bring adjusters from other places, but while you bring them, train them, it's like there's this volume issue because of the spikiness of the event that is just incredibly difficult to deal with. And I think that's where technology can really help, either packaging completely new products that avoid that entirely, or technology that enables much more expedited claims process in very high volume situations.
So, how do you fix it? Or how do you improve it?
Right. So from our perspective, I think the first step is to realize that we don't have to fix everything all at once. We
Hmm.
can start by building products that work really well within the context of that product, right? So, for example, the very first product we ever launched was a microinsurance policy in Puerto Rico. It was the first microinsurance policy under the NAIC that was fully admitted. And this policy wasn't trying to like replace a property policy or wasn't even trying to be bundled with a property policy or anything like that. It was a standalone parametric policy that provides fixed cash amounts based on wind speed intensity, basically, and
Hmm.
it's modeled based on kind of like how those excess expenses look after the hurricane, right? So like if it's a really strong hurricane, what does that mean? How much am I going to have to spend in food, gasoline, and like what are these monetary amounts, right? So that's what the regulator was looking at in this product. And what we found by launching that product was that there were a lot of people, like I would say maybe 80% or more, that were buying the product not because they were trying to supplement something, but because literally they were uninsurable otherwise, right? Because that was it. That was their only way, right, to get any form of safety net after the hurricane was that policy. And it was really eye opening to me because you wouldn't think Puerto Rico, with its penetration rate in insurance, it's very high in Latin American standards. I think it's over 12%, something like that. You would think this wouldn't be a problem, but all of a sudden we uncovered a giant gap that no one was really looking at. And all of a sudden you have like this massive amount of people who just literally could not get any traditional product, right? So for those individuals, you fixed a problem, which is a complete lack of safety net, right? And I think and this product was specifically designed to solve that, right? That specific
Hmm.
gap. And I think this product innovation is what's basically required to be able to start patching these gaps where they are so that you can truly have universal coverage. And you mentioned, for example, Monte Carlo before the call,
Yeah.
the conference, right? And
Yep.
I think the CEO of Peak Re mentioned that the insurance industry needs more innovation to cover the gaps, right? And they
Hmm.
talk about how it's not so much of like, oh, we need to push more sales, but rather we need to develop new products, like legitimately new products to cover new risks that are either perceived or have already manifested, like COVID. And that's exactly how we see it as well, right? Like climate change creates new problems, and that requires new solutions. And I see it very much as a expanding the pie as opposed to cannibalizing the pie.
Yeah, I think about, especially from your experience, is that aha moment that it's more about they're not covered. and what they need is that external parameter that will underwriting that specific risk, which is the wind. You know what's the wind velocity, you know what kind of risk it's going to cause, and once it reaches a certain velocity, okay, trigger the insurance. But
Yeah.
for that specific individual, yeah, it gives them some sort of coverage that the conventional, well, you have an admitted product, so the common products don't cover because, or they basically are not eligible for them.
So in Puerto Rico we are, but it depends on the market actually.
Okay.
So in we work really well with other MGAs, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately what we want to do is push out product and embed with whatever the channel is. So there are channels that don't require an MGA, right? So for example, government is a great example. In Mexico, we work with the government of Mexico and a consortium of reinsurers that include Swiss Re, AXA, Munich Re, Guy Carpenter, right, as the reinsurance broker, and like that doesn't require, right, an MGA because it's like a government kind of sanctioned
Mm-hmm.
policy through a local government insurer, etc. And ultimately for us, it's really that focus on what's the problem here, right? How do we resolve that problem, and how can we be part of that solution, providing the core technology that's required to like actually solve that. And that includes sometimes everything from enrollment all the way to like executing payments, right? So it's really that holistic view of building these products, and we're super excited because what we've really seen is that in every market that we launch something new, it's the first time in that market that that new thing has ever been launched, and it's just really interesting to kind of see um, how new trends create, right? So like when we started out with the first microinsurance policy in Puerto Rico, there are now more like 5 different types of policies, right? And they're all distributed in different ways, and they all have all these mechanisms, and that excites me because it's like I'm not going to take credit for that wave, but it's really great to be part, right, of that
Mm-hmm.
wave and see, oh, okay, people are actually trying to think about how do we cover this gap in dynamic and new ways.
Okay, so do me a favor. Give me a little bit of order here. Help me here, because what type of products do you have, and where?
Yeah,
We know Puerto Rico.
yeah,
We heard about Mexico, parametric, doing embedded insurance. How did
yeah,
you start? What was the first product? Where and
yeah.
what?
Yeah, so the first product was the policy in Puerto Rico that I mentioned.
Yeah.
That was basically our first product. After that, we launched an agricultural set of products with an insurance company in Jamaica. And then we did the deployment in Mexico that is technically still live. And now we have a new deployment in Colombia that also goes live soon, and a bunch of others that are kind of like in process. But fundamentally, for us, I get this question a lot, like, oh, what are you like from an MGA, like, like, are you an MGA, are you a broker? And they try to fit us into a very specific box. And the way I see it
Yeah.
is always from the side of the consumer. It's like there's a channel. Let's say the channel is banking. The
Mm-hmm.
bank wants a product. They want to offer a product. Who's actually going to build that product? So who builds it, right? Who builds the product for that bank? And that's where we come in and we say, I'll build the product for you. I'll bring you the capacity. I'll bring you the infrastructure. I'll structure the whole thing for you. I'll deliver it for you, and I'll integrate it with your core systems. And I will give it to you fully packaged so that you don't have to deal with that chaos, right? And we call it abstracting the chaos. Like there's all of this chaos that's required
I
to
love it.
build. Yeah, it's because it's complex, right? This is incredibly difficult, and that's what I hear a lot oftentimes from the industry. It's like, oh man, doing this is so hard. Like covering these people is so incredibly difficult. Like all these small scale farmers, how do we reach them? How do we? That's so difficult. And my response is always, yeah, it's very difficult, but that's our core. That's exactly what we do, right? Like solving that difficult problem is exactly where we excel, and that's exactly what we focus on.
Is everything micro insurance, or you?
It's a great question. So, it's funny because it's not like we try to be microinsurance, but most is like truly it ends up being microinsurance. I think it's mostly
Mhm.
because embedded products tend to be microinsurance products, and because of that, most of our products are embedded, so they're microinsurance by definition. And also because everything we do is mass consumer focused, right? Like high volume, high throughput. Like we're not trying to be parametric brokers, right? We're not
Hmm.
trying to like build one-off policies for X or Y client or anything like that. Very much what we're doing is mass scale. So it's like we have a large group of people. We need to protect that large group of people. What's the right product to do so, and what's the right channel to reach them? Like those are the questions that we're asking ourselves. And oftentimes the solution is a microinsurance product.
What's your definition of a microinsurance product?
Honestly, right now I've seen all sorts of terms. Mine is just policies that have low coverage limits. It's a very broad one, right? But just basically we're talking about limits that are, in the couple thousand. It depends on obviously on the market, right? Couple
Hmm.
thousands for one person in one market is a lot, and for another it might not. But we're
Yeah.
talking about policies that definitely aren't competing with traditional policies in any way or form.
Okay. So it's about the limits, the coverage. Also, does it have any limitation in terms of time?
In
The
payment?
Yeah, not
Yeah,
payment.
yeah, yeah.
In
Yeah,
terms of the
so
coverage, the policy
oftentimes
life.
they're yearly. They're yearly. They're very
Okay.
often yearly, but it depends again a little bit on the channel, right? So we do have products that have multi-year cycles. We're talking
Hmm.
about like 5-year contracts, right? So it really depends.
Yeah, cool. Very cool. This is actually very exciting. And it's when you're talking about, oh, okay, we need to ask about the embedded part. What's your definition of embedded? Because we've seen so many.
Oh man, now I feel like I'm on the spot. I don't want to mess
Why?
it up
No.
for people who feel very passionate about the definition of embedded. But to me, embedded insurance is insurance that isn't marketed, right? So insurance that wasn't like, an entity that went out and found customers for that specific insurance, but rather insurance that is as close as possible to the insurable interest. Like we
Hmm.
call it like the checkbox, right? Is it a
Yep.
checkbox? Is it as simple as I'm buying a product and I want this other solution, or maybe it's bundled by default, right? To me, that's embedded, where you're essentially not marketing the product at all. You're just integrating into the channel, and I think that's where it's super powerful, and it's a really interesting thing. Like actually, when I think about it, it is a little strange that insurance is sold the way that it is. Like you'd think it would have been embedded from the beginning, and there are lots of things in this world that function like that we never think about twice. So an example that I always mention is, Amazon's return policy, or like e-commerce's return policy, that is incorporated into the pricing of everything, right? You just assume that it's there. And obviously you're paying for it, right? A return policy is integrated. I could see a universe, an alternate multiverse universe, where return policies are actually insurance products, right? And you just, you pay, hey, on this Amazon order, do you want to pay $1.53 on the off chance that it isn't what you wanted and you return it, right? I could
But you
see
actually
that.
you
Yep, go
have
ahead.
it already. You have it already for the owner. So if sorry for the seller. So if I'm the seller, I will buy insurance against returns for the shipping, for the cost. If it's damage on the way back or on the way to the customer, there are
Right.
products
But
that
you
are out
don't
there.
but you don't offer it. Yeah, but you don't offer it to you integrate it as a benefit. It's like fully
Hmm.
part of the cycle, right?
Yes.
And I think that's probably the way insurance should work, if it could, right? That would be ideal for everyone. Where if I buy the house, I get the insurance in the moment, right? If I rent a car, I get it in the moment. And I think that would be a lot easier also for customers to understand, because they're thinking about the risk in that context, in that transaction. The fact that insurance is sold separately and I need to think about the risk and then go and find insurance is very disjointed, right? And I think that's part of the reason why selling products and insurance is so difficult. And I've heard that mantra 1,000 times. I'm sure you've heard it too, where insurance is sold, not bought. I'm pretty sure
Hmm.
that's part of the reason why people feel so strongly about that.
I think it's too integrated into the culture. So differentiate between US culture and European. I'm less familiar with. Let's take these two examples. So think about you go to a restaurant. In the US, you'll have the price, then on top of it, you'll have the tax, and then on top of it, you'll have that extra tax, which will be a tip. Europe, that's the price. That's it. Because it's already
Baked
includes
in.
the tax and include the tip, or basically the salary of the person who is cooking and serving you the food, right? It's a different mentality, different culture. Now, if you're going to do that in the US, with that culture will not collide and go like, oh, now basically the car is going to cost that much, or the house is going to cost that much, right? They've done a few experiments with restaurants in the US that that's a price and that's what you're paying because the gadget you're already included, everything is included, but people didn't understand and thought and mentally already did the calculation and added that to the final cost. So that restaurant closed its shop and business. Um, but that can be interesting. It will be interesting to see that as an embedded insurance or an integrated
Yeah.
insurance into the
I
final cost.
Yeah, and I've had this debate a couple times. It's an interesting, not even a debate, it's just an interesting conversation with Luis, who's had so much experience in Latin America, that hope, cultural hope, is a factor in purchasing insurance as well, right? So like
Interesting.
if you have and I've seen this in my life as well with my family, like if you have a very like a very hope kind of type culture, like very religious, right? Where everything is like in the hands of God, right? Kind of that mentality, and that's how it's been developed. Um, those people tend to not necessarily get insurance because everything is going to be fine, right? Everything's okay. We're in God's hands, and he's, you know, it's been funny to hear him talk about how that has actually been some of the struggles in the region, right? Of like getting people to understand, like, yeah, that's a that's obviously, you can believe that, but you can also get insurance, right? Is an interesting thing, and I've noticed that for sure. In talking to so many clients and going through a region, it's like there's this hope factor that kicks in and really makes a difference when it comes to purchasing.
I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I didn't even notice that the time passes. So let's do that. Let's talk about the team, future plans, and then I'll ask you the last question that I ask everyone, which is about a recommendation, about a life hack or anything like that, including hey, where we should actually play strategic games. But let's start with the team. Can you tell about the team and what's your future plan for the company?
Yeah. So most of our footprint right now in Raincoat are data scientists and engineers. I think that's the core. We have obviously insurance experts like Luis that I've mentioned throughout the call. But it's a very tech heavy team, and that's exactly how we like it, and we'll continue operating it because a lot of what we do is complicated and difficult, and from integrations to models to analyzing data sets and data providers, like that whole thing, right, requires a core team there. And the team comes from the usual suspects of basically technology companies, right? Microsoft,
Mm-hmm.
Google, Oracle, NASA. So we have a really great, solid technical team, and our insurance team is just as good too, coming from companies like Chubb. Just really great people all around. And what connects all of us is that we've gone through these disasters firsthand. Like every single one of us has gone through some sort of life changing kind of natural disaster. So we really have empathy on the consumer side of that equation, which is why we're very product focused in that sense. Our plans right now are to grow and expand in geographies. We started expanding through Latin America because of word of mouth and because the co-founders, we speak Spanish. But the reality is that we want to not only continue that expansion right across new territories that we haven't been in, but also new partners. Right, we're very open to new partners, new opportunities. It doesn't matter if you're an insurance company or a channel or a reinsurer or a broker, right? We're always open to having a conversation and see if there's any way that we could possibly help in delivering the solution that's missing. That piece of the puzzle that hasn't quite fallen in place.
And now for the final question, can you give us a recommendation? Something, it can be a book, a film, or a life hack, whatever you feel on, whatever you think that people
Yeah.
should know.
So it's funny. I have the books behind me, and I'm surrounded by books. I love books. And I feel like I have a different book depending on the context of the person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I will say just a random discovery that I had recently. It was a really sweet book. Might not be for everyone. Was this one? I recently finished reading it, called The Untethered Soul: The Journey Beyond Yourself. I know it sounds a little wishy-washy, but it was recommended on a startup, kind of like another website, and I was like, oh, I've never read this one, and it was actually surprisingly good. Very Buddhist in its way, but I think this is probably a good generalist book that could apply to literally every single person, regardless of industry, startup or non-startup. So that's why I think this is going to be my pick. It's obviously top of mind because I recently read it, but that would be my recommendation.
Fantastic. Jonathan, thank you very, very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure too.